panel, Can Visual Culture Be Global? Tim Marlowe, please, to the floor.
Thank you.
Round of applause.
No need.
Thank you. Thank you.
There was a moment last night, I think hopefully you were all at the performance of Rabi Abu Khalil, where I was aware of the fact there was a Beirut-born musician versed in extraordinary traditions of the Middle East, playing with an American drummer who'd archaeologically explored traditions of South India and Africa, and an Italian accordion player playing a piece about British cuisine and crispy fish fingers. And I had a kind of Greenbergian moment of revelation, as Troy Terrian was talking about yesterday, as to this is what globalization could lead to in a good and a bad way. Only the cuisine is bad. But one of the things we want to discuss in this panel now is the broad question is can we have global visual culture? But there's an underpinning, which you may have seen in the booklet, which is global culture too strong? And obviously, with the idea of a lot of museums seeking to explore other histories, other narratives, there's an admirable tendency to try and represent globally. But at the same time, there is a danger, which I want to explore, that it becomes a kind of global bog standard, where everything becomes similar, and that the very localism and diversity that the traditions and the approaches were set out to enact and to explore get negated. So, to explore that, we've got a panel of three people. Megan Tamati-Quinnell is a curator of modern and contemporary Maori and indigenous art at Te Papa in Wellington, New Zealand. Ilana Brundin is the CEO of the Norval Foundation, just outside Cape Town in South Africa, and she was previously one of the directors of the Sites Museum. And finally, Axel Ruge, who has a distinguished career in museums. He's currently the director of the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. He's about to be CEO of the Royal Academy in London, which means he's going to be my boss, so I'm looking forward to the opportunity of interrogating him in the public arena here. Ilana, if I'd start with you. Oh, thank you. Everything's precarious intellectually, but literally here. Ilana, you've been involved in the foundation over the last 3-4 years of two new institutions that have, and I'm summarizing here, broadly Pan-African aspirations. And there's been contentiousness around them, but also a lot of celebration. Just take us through briefly the issues that went around the setting up of those two organizations and what their remit is in terms of local, regional, national, and Pan-African identity.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks for having me. It's been, of course, in Africa, we haven't had proper monumental museums for more than 100 years. So 1902, I think, was the Cairo Museum. So for us, it was like a, incredibly a wonderful moment when funding and the founders and we could start to build a Zeitsmoker. Of course, me being local, my whole life there, being an Afrikaans woman, we've got such a diverse community, specifically in South Africa. So things that I saw underlining there was our young generations were embarrassed to be, from Africa. They were. They didn't want to speak the languages. They were really not proud of being African, and that's one of the underpins of doing and wanting to build museums, to tell our own narratives, to have our own platforms, to have our artists being proud to show in our own museums, and we were least worried about globalization and a bland kind of world out there. I at a stage read in a magazine that the Baltimore Museum sold one of their prize Andy Warhols to acquire African arts, and specifically Zanele Mahule. And I remember how extremely proud I was, because of, having somebody like that on the international stage. But that was why it was so important for us to have this specific younger than 2000 moment at Zeitsmoker, focusing on the young identities, on how they've shifted. And now at the Norval Foundation, which was a dream come true, because to have two institutions opening 7 months apart on that scale, it doesn't easily happen. And again, we decided to look at, our recent past, because of our very specific history in South Africa, to fill in some of the gaps that's been, overlooked, making sure that artists who have never had museum exhibitions, brilliant artists, woodcarvers like Ezra Mlagai and Sydney Kumalo, people that's never been recognized. And Jackson Hlongwane, we just won a commencement prize through Sotheby's, and Okwe Nwenze was one of the last comments he made to say how important that was, that we're filling in those gaps. So we're looking at our recent past, but also our future, and looking at the shifts and trying to be part of the global village. So we're very, very happy and proud to be at least there in some way.
Briefly, how will you enact your global remit? I mean, so filling in the gaps, choosing artists that deserve opportunity and to be showcased more, artists that you believe in, but how does the global part operate? You want to do partnerships with institutional museums?
Yeah, that would be the dream. I mean, we're only 11 months old. We're hoping to do good work, so well. Our research, our team is really focused on trying to put up exhibitions, and we prize ourselves so far with, of course, looking at where we are. We can't really, yes, we're working with some of our new young artists, but it's the combinations of how we do exhibitions that we think is going to be important. Also looking at this broader-based, maybe blandness of the art world as globalization takes over. I think there's going to be more focus on the curators to make sure that doesn't happen, that we do work with our shared humanity and pull out these elements. And so we are looking at positioning our artists that we feel has been overlooked, and hoping that the world would also take notice of that.
It's interesting, you allude to the idea of curatorial responsibility in a conference in a summit rather, where we're looking at cultural responsibility in general. Megan, your institution, for many, is exemplary, but it's a long way away from many places. It's very near other places. But to my discredit, it was only last year I was able to visit for the first time. What is the remit of Te Papa for those who haven't been? Just for you to explain.
Okay, firstly, just I want to mihi atu kia koutou. I want to thank you first for inviting me to be here and the Cultural Summit organisers. Te Papa is a bicultural institution by statute, as far as I understand. The Te Papa Act, which went through Parliament, ensured that it was a bicultural institution, and it's based on the foundations of the Treaty of Waitangi, which is kind of the founding document of New Zealand. It was signed in 1840, and so there's two kind of groups in New Zealand, which is the Māori nations, a number of tribes, not everybody signed it, and everybody else who's there by the right of the treaty, so that's everybody. So Te Papa is kind of it's made up of the National Art Gallery, which was the National Art Gallery, the National Museum, and the Natural History Unit. So it's kind of like a Smithsonian, but its remit is really about I suppose, preserving and also expressing the cultures that exist within the country and externally. We built a new gallery last year called Toy Art, the Toy Art Gallery, so it's a gallery within the museum, which has its problems, of course, because how do you stop it being historicised work as soon as it gets into a museum kind of context? But the manifesto that was kind of we developed as a curatorial team, was to kind of highlight Māori Pacific, which is the broader region that we are part of, and international from a New Zealand perspective. Again, because we are way away from everything and we don't have a huge amount of money, there's no way that we can buy or have major international shows. We bring stuff in, sometimes partner with organisations, museums or galleries in Australia. The Oceania project that you did at the Royal Academy, we set up partnerships. But really having that kind of focus of a local inflection of how you represent international art. And it's interesting, in some of the collections we decided we couldn't buy major international works because we didn't have the money. So they developed this print portfolio, actually, so works on paper. So could get some really extraordinary works on paper from really significant artists, but not sculptures or paintings or, yeah. So that's...
One of the experiences that we had in London working on the Oceania show was the extraordinary collaboration and the sense that, I mean, I didn't mean when I said it's a long way from many places from London, I meant that actually the gap between different islands and different communities and different cultures in Oceania is vast, and yet it is, to some extent, a coherent region, as well as one that acknowledges difference in a very, I think, a collegial and collaborative way. Of course, there are tensions too. I wonder whether you at Te Papa, and you as a curator of Maori, and there are tribal groupings within Maori, of course, and then Indigenous art, whether ownership, cultural ownership, is a massive problem, or it's something that you manage to navigate reasonably easily. Because it's something I want to discuss more broadly in a minute with everyone, but that there is often a sense that people they own their culture and their traditions, and they want to express it and share it, but on their terms. How does that work for you?
I think because I work in the I work in a contemporary art area. Of course, it's both. It's kind of local and global, and it is both Māori and other. You know, even art in a Western sense. And I mean, I've been doing a lot of work around the idea of Māori modernism, where artists in the late 40s, early 50s, it mostly came from Māori urbanisation, migration to the cities, and then took on kind of European modernism and wanted to be seen as modern artists, not Māori artists, but modern artists, and as kind of contemporary as their contemporaries. Of course, that wasn't really supported. Both the Māori communities didn't know what they were doing and felt like they were kind of bastardising the culture, and the European kind of wouldn't allow them in. So majority of those artists weren't recognised and are only starting to be recognised now. And some of them, as I said, began working in the late 40s, early 50s. So I can't remember what your question was again.
What about ownership?
Ownership. I think there's iwi ownership, and then we have a principle called mana taonga. And mana taonga is about acknowledging, I suppose, the origin culture of that artwork, and it can be individual. So it might be in terms of empowering or working with the family of an artist, or if they're deceased, or an artist, or themselves, about how they might want to be represented in the collection. And that thing of privileging probably an iwi voice or a community voice. So we have a number of projects, one which is a iwi-based exhibition where the tribes can I worked on the Ngaitahu one, which I am connected to. I was asked by my tribe to curate the show, and it was the first kind of major survey of our art and practice, and they wanted to show themselves both historically and in modernity. They did not want to be kind of locked back in the past, but it was their view of themselves. So,
but with a view to other people understanding and the view being shared.
Yeah, and I think it's fluid. I mean, not everything is owned, as in owned. I don't know if it's that kind of essential. I think things are more open. I mean, what's really interesting with those Māori modernist artists in the 50s and 60s was their Pākehā contemporaries who were also kind of looking at a local form of modernism through Māori art.
Thank you. I didn't want to romanticise my experience of New Zealand culture, but I do think it's both integrated and open and generous. Of course, there are cultural tensions, but it's interesting to hear that as a potential way forward for other institutions. Axel, yeah.
Sorry, yes, I'm from my side, with us, it's very important who tells the story, especially, you know, if you look at, I chose to have a curator from the outside, a Canadian, and I was criticised in the beginning for that, and I'm sure you know Owen very well. He's a brilliant curator, and by looking at, they curate as a group, but it's amazing to see how it's changed, because a lot of people have now come and say they absolutely love the fact that this group and this lens, the outside lens looking in, and we've never had that before. So it was very important who owns, who tells the story, but it is also shifting.
Axel, as a German-born, previously London-based museum director in Amsterdam, with a kind of cultural ownership, in inverted commas, of Van Gogh, who was outsider. Now, I guess you couldn't get more, well, a mainstream, or part of the mainstream narrative, but also who becomes one of those artists who seems to be as global as it is possible to be. Why that phenomenon? Why is Van Gogh? Why does he seem to resonate so globally? Is it kind of celebrity culture, or is it more nuanced than that?
Well, I think it is more nuanced than that. Well, first of all, of course, Van Gogh also responds to all our fantasies about what an artist should be like. He is sort of the almost the cliche of the artist. Misunderstood in his own time, difficult human being, could hardly hold down any relationships with people around him. Then, of course, his art, misunderstood in his own time, now really sought after. It's still very, very accessible to our day. It's everyday subject matter. It's colorful. It's energetic. So it just speaks also to our modern aesthetic sentiment, on many, many different levels. And then, of course, also the, I guess, romantic notion and the myth that arises around someone who prematurely is ripped from life with a promising talent that is never truly fulfilled. And there's nothing more that fascinates human beings more than the question, what would have happened if? Had he lived longer? Would he have become famous? Would he have embraced abstraction? Whatever else you might project onto him, none of these questions will ever be answered, but we will, always wonder. So all of that makes him, the sort of perfect storm, if you like, of an artist that we can relate to. And also there's a lot known about his personal struggle, his personal strife. Because of his letters, he writes extensively about his condition, about his development. So all of that gives us plenty of also access points, if you like, to relate our own experience. And we find that in our museum, a very enormous international audience. And to speak about, we were talking about digital means, the Van Gogh Museum has one of the biggest, if not the biggest, online engagement rate of any art museum in the world. And that has everything to do with the emotional dimension around Van Gogh and that emotional connection that people have. And so all of that together then also makes, in our present day, through media, through the art market, through the exhibition machine, if you want to call it that also he has become a global celebrity and is sort of almost a brand now.
How much does the museum take credit or can be blamed for that situation? I mean, you have the largest collection, but the Van Gogh mythology has been multifarious, hasn't it? From books, from films, from Western public taste, and also his engagement with, say, Japanese art and the fact that there's an input with Van Gogh. But is this something that you have sought globally, consciously, as a strategy to expand and exploit, in inverted commas?
Yeah, I think you could say that, yes, we could be credited and blamed both. Of course, for us, the mission of the museum literally says that we want to bring as many people as we possibly humanly can into contact with Van Gogh and have him inspire them. So, it is also inherent to the mission of the museum. And we have certainly also sought that out. We're trying to use every possible channel that we can to share his work and his life. And his life story, and then the byproduct of that is in the current market, and that is also something where you have to find out, how you want to navigate that, is that whole sort of commercial dimension around it. And we're a museum that, is largely self-sufficient, so there's also some kind of notion of having to, earn a living, as it were, as a museum. So, that plays into the whole thing as well. But I think we really, yes, in that sense also we are to blame. I don't want to go quite as far as call it cultural colonialism, but, to take Van Gogh out there into the world. And there's still vast areas where he's not that, seen yet. So, the museum might want to go even further with that.
Watch this space after your departure. You mentioned the C word, colonialism. Let's mention post-colonialism, Megan, which is a kind of interesting phenomenon. But I'm conscious that Te Papa could be accused of a kind of post-colonial hegemony in the region. How do you navigate that?
Well, I think there's some of that in there. And I suppose, the artists I work with are contemporary artists. So have gone to art school, they've been influenced by all sorts of things, and there might be a local kind of reference to their work as well as located and not located in the country. I suppose, I don't know if I know how to answer that in terms of a hegemony. I think you could accuse Te Papa of like a new orthodoxy, I suppose, in some ways. I think we're always trying to shift and challenge that. I'm not sure, and maybe through the programming and the way in which it's programmed, I don't think, I think we're still, we haven't come to any conclusions, if you know what I mean. It's still a very open kind of process, and things continue to kind of evolve and shift and change. They're not set, they're not, that's probably a little abstract.
So we talk about the canon, and we usually mean the Western canon, and I think there's a broad understanding and a desire amongst most institutions to at least challenge that, if not actually to acknowledge there's a multiplicity of stories or canons. Do you think there's a danger, though, in this broader discussion about localism, regionalism, different identities, different stories, that in the end our impulse institutionally is to co-opt everything into an ever-expanding single mainstream? Or are we genuinely fragmented in good and healthy ways in the way that art is explored in museums around the world?
Well, I wish the latter was the case, and I very much hope that in our times, as there are more voices also becoming heard, and we are also much more sensitized to all sorts of views and ways we present the narrative, the stories, that this will arise. The sad truth, though, is at the moment, I feel, and that is, and I don't want to point fingers at contemporary art museums, but if you look around, very many of them in places also where people travel to, kind of look the same. And also collections seem to become somewhat interchangeable, at least on the international level. And so it's high time that we also find ways to go back to more emphatic individual profiles. Of course, you want to present as a museum to a broad audience, a diversity and broad cross-section of art that is being produced in many different places. So yes, you want to bring things together from various aspects, but there's a lot to be said, I think, for a greater emphasis on individual character of institutions, on individual voices of institutions, so that we do not end up in this sort of and I don't want to single out, MoMA, but this kind of a general model of a modern art museum that all kind of collect the same, and everyone has to have a Kiefer, and everyone has to have a Richter now, and everyone has to have a Yayoi Kusama, and that's all very international, but it's all kind of more of the same. And I wish there was more a drift back to more emphatic voices, even if you have an international collection.
I think there was an Australian art historian, Terry Smith, who talked about how, with globalisation in this new age, art shifting from modern to contemporary and kind of converging with, new technologies and cheaper travel and all of those kinds of things coming together. But he talks about how that doesn't mean the convergence needs to be a collapse into sameness. And actually what it then does, being more connected, means that there's more emphasis on difference. And that difference is the thing that kind of keeps people interested. You don't want to go and have a McDonald's experience of art around the world. You want to go and have a local experience, maybe. And it might be just a kind of cultural inflection of a kind of a global phenomenon. So the thing about Māori modernism is a local inflection of a global phenomenon, but it's specific and it's related to place. So I think that, for me, is kind of maybe some of the nuance, and it is nuance. It's not that kind of can maybe shift that idea of global art, culture.
Which you've...
So, yeah, just to relate to that, I'm understanding that, but I do remind myself always that we kind of talk of the global trotters who see this museums the same. I mean, the people that I know, 98% of them can't travel. They only see my museum. And so that is a reality for me. And I think sometimes around the world, yes, there's this diversification of museum collections. I think sometimes it's also for them to kind of create new energy in those collections while they're adding to it. I think that, but I remind myself that my reality is not everybody's, and that my community around me cannot jump on a plane and see those museums. And so I kind of look at it in a way of, yes, we have to try and fill in so many, we have to almost look at the past and the future and re-examine and get a fuller picture. And we want to show a global kind of view. It's very important, not to get stuck. Everybody else is moving on. So where we are, we're trying to, play this balance of keeping our community close, making them feel safe in the way we program, but also showing them the broader world and kind of taking them with us.
I think actually that's a super important point, because indeed we are so used 87% of my audience travels to come to Amsterdam to see the museum. It's very, very different demographic. And of course, they're used to seeing, different places with great ease. And so while we want to emphasize the local and the idiosyncratic and the own voice, there's also something to be said, of course, that you do want a, if you like, mainstream part of the collection as well for your local audience that cannot travel. Because, of course, in a way, also a British museum, for all its ills, was conceived as a showcase of the world to an audience that at the time could not travel all over the place. So, there is something about the premise also of the bigger museums, the more comprehensive museums, that they allow you to travel, if you like, while you stay local, in a way. So to reconcile those different demands of the strong local voice, the idiosyncratic, and at the same time also to showing, giving a sort of outlook into the world, as it were, through your museum, is something that I don't know whether we will ever properly reconcile it, but these are forces that we have to deal with.
And I think, for Māori people, we signed the treaty so we could be part of the world, didn't want to just be local. And we are huge travellers because we're at the other end of the world. So if you want to go and have that experience, you do go to institutions around the world to see a real this or that. Otherwise people were looking at, historically, people were looking at things in magazines, or books or whatever they could get their hands on, because they didn't get to see those works. But then there's also an interesting flip that you can do to that with someone like Peter Jackson, who's a filmmaker, obviously, and rather than going to Hollywood, he wanted Hollywood to come to him. So he set up this whole thing where he can do something that Hollywood can't do back in New Zealand. I don't know if you can do that. I know artists who are trying to do that, have an international career based in New Zealand, but majority of our younger artists go off and position themselves internationally if they want to be taken seriously as artists internationally. They have to be based in London or Berlin or wherever. They can't negotiate that from a home space.
Just briefly, Alexandra Munro threw down a gauntlet and said it may be one of the action points of this summit to have a virtual museum, particularly of objects that are not seen very often, that are in basements, but also in the different museums. An admirable idea. But we are where we are with encyclopedic museums, and you're quite right, Axel, to bring up the point of the British Museum. It was a way of travelling without travelling. So there is obviously an issue about whether these museums should be disbanded in the future and everything should be returned. I think that needs a much more nuanced debate than just some grandstanding and saying they should be or shouldn't be. I really believe that. But I do think it's interesting what the status now of encyclopedic museums are. So no one in their right mind, would try and set that up now, or would they?
Well, I guess no one in their right mind would, simply because it's a mer à boire. Where to begin? And of course, also the big ones are in certain places, that's sort of mutually reinforcing, if you
But
like.
the Louvre Abu Dhabi has told a very, I think, nuanced and complicated story about human civilizations and the evolution of it all. And when we get to the 20th century, without being critical, it's a mess, not because the museum is, but because the 20th century and the 21st century is so conflicted. Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it is definitely a big discussion also in the museum community and also with the big museums. And they're enormously struggling with that because they're getting also criticized and attacked from all sides. And of course, more voices, want to be heard and need to be heard. And how do you incorporate all of that? And I guess one also needs to add to the nuance, one has to make a distinction between historical objects that have religious meaning, that were artifacts in a different way from autonomous contemporary works of art about ownership, repatriation, and all those issues. But the big museums definitely have an enormous task. I do still believe that there is a role for them if they can deal with their collections responsibly, return the things that can be returned, but also retain a certain, because they will still function as a repository of human history, of human creation, and then it's a matter also how do you then make that accessible. And it could also be, we're talking, as I heard, about a virtual VR museum. Of course, many of these collections are actually accessible online. It is not as if everything is just lingering in the dark and storage. Though the digital experience and the VR museum raises the whole other complex field of questions about the fetish that we associate with the original, with the actual object.
Or the communality of sharing
and
the
the communality of sharing those. So, it's a very, very complex, and I think we're only at the beginning of a much broader conversation about what the place of these institutions is. You used the word hegemony. The question, that's immediately, of course, a slightly negative term, but there's also something to be said. Te Papa also has a certain power, if you like, and that doesn't necessarily need to be a bad thing to interpret, to make conversations possible, to make works accessible, because there's also a certain effort that needs to go into preserving and making objects accessible. It's not as if they're just there and it's a sort of free-for-all. That it also needs to be negotiated.
So we call historical material, Māori material, taonga, as in cultural treasures, I suppose. And but it's interesting because there is a difference between, I think, modern and contemporary art and taonga. The way in which they came into museums and galleries is quite different. Too often, you have artists who want to be in a collection and taonga that perhaps was co-opted in other ways and there. But what's also interesting is you have artists like, and he was in, one of the artists that was in your Oceania project is a guy called Tene Waitere, who was a master carver and who was kind of global before that even became a kind of thing, because he really had agency. And so 4 of the 5 carved meeting houses that exist outside of the country, one called Rodu, which is in Germany, he participated in its removal and relocation somewhere else, because actually he wanted people to see Māori work and practice, and he kind of foresaw a future where people were travelling and there was something of theirs somewhere else. So he felt like that was kind of an honour to have that somewhere and to be part of a global culture.
Right.
So we're talking 18.
And that's something I'd like
90s.
to pick up with you this afternoon in the workshop. We've already had 5 minutes docked off this session. We were 45 minutes, we're 40 minutes. We're going to stick to time.
Yes.
So I'm going to throw it out to the floor now. And I don't mind statements, but please be brief. A brief question or a brief statement so that we can at least get 2 or 3 interjections from the floor. There's the orange boxes are coming around. Questions? Yeah, there's a woman over there. If you just wait for the mic, and then we'll maybe get another one.
Hello. Thank you so much for that. This is, I'm afraid, more of a comment than a question. Well, it is a question as well, but thinking through this sort of keeping the global and the local alive, and also in the context of some sort of return, yes, to places where the stuff has been taken from and exhibited in the West and so on, to transform that power dynamic and maybe make things local and global in different contexts. It seems to me that what's happening here, right, in Abu Dhabi is a very interesting model, but that's happening because Abu Dhabi has money. And I'm wondering if for those countries of the global south, for whom these questions are so important that have been discussed here, that could be something to be discussed, right? I mean, what does the West and different countries of the West, you know, the loci of these major museums where artists still need to go, right? And develop their international careers. Why not find ways to put some of that money back into those communities and those countries and let them run the show so that local artists actually can have those international careers and conversations, but in those places and in those spaces.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask Ilana first, because it's interesting. Sites is nominally, I mean, we were told it was a lot of external money. Turns out there's a lot of state money being put into that. The Norva Foundation is based on private funding totally.
Yes.
So how do you respond to that?
Well, it's a question I ask myself every day. I would love, I mean, I think it's going to be key that, you know, that there should be more money activation in Africa. And it kind of seems like a simple answer. You know, if we have to help the continent to put up these institutions or these platforms.
Well, just to add to that, because I think it's a bit of a chicken or the egg discussion. Because on the one hand, you could argue if some of the big, names, if you like, because we were discussing this beforehand. Of course, it's not called the Flim Flam Museum of Abu Dhabi. No, it's the Louvre Abu Dhabi, and it's the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi. So, big names are clearly being brought in. Money or no, in order to spearhead something, to get a development going. And so that's an avenue you can choose and say that's the spearhead, and on the back of that, a lot of other developments. Or you turn it around and say, no, you start on the local level, but, then it's a whole different journey. Yes. But, there is, and I don't want to put my foot in it, but of course here, they've chosen for the big brand names, and we all hope, and I think that's also one of the big challenges in the museum field, that we're perceiving this widening gap between, in a way, you want to say the haves and the have-nots. That's to say the big name museums, the big brand names that have very dominant position, and the rest, and that unfortunately the big ones are not able to carry along the small local ones. So people who come to my museum, because it says in the guidebook you have to see Van Gogh, when they're back in Flim Flam Town, they will not go to their own local museum based on the experience in our museum. And that is, I think, one of the shortcomings and one of the big challenges.
Unless we get also a big rock star to come and do a performance video now.
All right. So let's take the next question. Sorry, just get one more in. Yeah.
Hi, Wal Bulston from Flint. My question is, particularly for new museums and foundations, do you think in today's world there is a responsibility or the opportunity to help tradition and culture evolve to contemporary audiences? So the traditional the traditional thing is to preserve, celebrate past traditions and culture. But when you live in this world where everyone's coming together, all the arts and cultures are being mixed together in different ways, is there a responsibility to help audiences reinterpret this in today's context so that you're not stuck on the past, but it's more how can you evolve this in the present?
I mean, for us, it's very much based on our public program, and we're really pushing that really hard. I mean, from, like we talking about the traveling, we have got a children's program, where art is the best passport, and we're really pushing that kind of, engagement on all different levels with our public program.
But I also want to break a lance really for more established museums, because I know they have a bit of a hard time, it seems, right now. But of course, that is what museums, if they are really good, and now also the bigger museums that are sort of really turning their eye to it, that's what they do. They constantly work on making historic objects, relevant to the present. They try to show, even we at the Van Gogh Museum, you could say, well, he's a historic artist. He's been dead for quite a long time. And we work every day, also with our local communities, with international communities, to show, why is he still relevant today? Why does he matter today? Why does he matter to you, on a very, very personal level? And that's, I think, what we've been doing.
I pride myself on sticking to time. So we're out of time, but I'm being given a code that we have one more question. So thank you. One more question. Thank you.
Paul McLinden from Glasgow. So I want to ask, coming back to your description of Van Gogh and his life, would Van Gogh survive in today's arts market? Because
well, actually,
let's stick the question. It's fine. The question is there.
He is surviving shockingly well in today's art market. Much to our detriment. I wish sometimes it weren't so. But the truth of the matter is, of course, it has everything to do with recognition, and you could only hope that he would have a very powerful gallerist. In today's market.
We end that now, because having talked globally, Van Gogh once again is in danger of taking over the whole debate. But thank you for the question. Axel Ruger, Eleanor Brundin, and Megan Tamati-Quinnell, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much for all the panelists. Another fascinating panel here. Thank you very much.